In this lesson, we'll talk about how to handle objections. Following that, we'll move on to how to earn commitment and closing the sale. In this lecture, specifically, we'll discuss sales resistance and the main reasons that buyers and prospects resist. We'll also talk about some of the ways to deal with resistance and objections, and what are the main types of objections that are raised by buyers. Part of this lesson will also include how to use what we call the LARC listening system as a response to resistance and objections. Resistance is a typical component of any type of sales situation. The buyer raises objections to a product or service during the sales presentation. Rather than thinking that your chance is over, usually these are viewed as opportunities to sell. They're a normal part of any sales conversation, but the salesperson will have to determine what is the actual customer interest and be able to measure or gauge the buyer's understanding of the problem. There's a good chance that some of the resistance or objections come from the buyer not having a full understanding of the value they can receive from the product or service that you're offering. The correct and proper handling of resistance can lead to customer acceptance if you're able to convey the information that will help them understand their situation better. There's a lot of different reasons why prospects will raise objections, and there's also many different strategies that salespeople can use to deal with them. Sometimes the buyer simply wants to avoid the sales dialogue or sales interview. A strategy to overcome this would be try to set an appointment that becomes part of the buyer's daily routine, rather than asking them to do something extra or additional in their workday. Sometimes the salesperson simply fails to prospect and qualify their leads properly. One way to overcome this is to ask questions to verify the prospect's interest. It's quite possible that this prospect is not right at this particular time. The buyer will not buy on the first sales call. It's very typical not to even ask for sale commitment on the first sales call. It's hard to develop a relationship and a trust-based relationship on the first sales call. A regular sales call on the prospect lets the prospect know that the salesperson is serious about this relationship and willing to have a long-term, two-way relationship with the prospect. Sometimes the prospect doesn't want to change their current way of doing business. This can sometimes be operational, and sometimes it can just be they're used to the old way. The salesperson's job is to help them understand that there is or could be a better solution than the one the prospect is currently using. Sometimes the prospect has failed to recognize a need. That's why the sales dialogue is so important. The salesperson must be able to show evidence that sparks the prospect's interest and show them that there is a need or perhaps a new solution to a problem. A prospect may lack information on a new product or on the salesperson's company. The salesperson has to continually work to add value by providing useful information. This might be particularly true if the prospect's business is new and they don't know a lot about different vendors, or if they have used the same vendor for many years. It could also be due to new technologies. Sometimes prospects are not aware of new developments in certain areas of business. Here are some of the most common types of objections that a prospect or buyer would use to try to deter the salesperson. One might be they don't have a need for your product at this time. They may just say, "I'm not interested." This could be legitimate in that they just purchased something similar recently, or they don't know that they need the product or service. They may object to the product or service specifically. They may have poor evaluations of the brand from past experience. They may have an objection to the company. Maybe they're just loyal to a competitor. They may have a price objection. This is probably the most common type of objection that is posed to salespeople. They may say that they have a budget and that your product or service would exceed their budget. Or maybe they simply don't see the value in the price of your product. There may be a time or delaying objection. They may say, well, we're interested, but really not at this time. Come back to me later. In that case, what you should do is take note of that and follow up with them when they ask you to. But there's a really good strategy that all salespeople should use and develop in order to negotiate buyer resistance. LARK is an acronym that stands for listen, acknowledge, assess, respond, and confirm. It's an effective process for salespeople to use in order to overcome sales resistance. This process is customer-oriented, and it's intended to keep the dialogue positive instead of becoming defensive. Let's talk about them individually. In listen, the salesperson should listen to what the buyer is saying. Try not to anticipate what the buyer will say and then cut them off with some kind of response. This would only make them irritated and angry. It's more than just about being polite or professional. The buyer's trying to tell you something and explain something to you that they consider important. And it's critical for the salesperson to listen. The next one is acknowledge. As buyers complete their statements, the salesperson should acknowledge that they have understood the message and appreciate what they're saying. You shouldn't automatically come with some kind of defensive response. You need to have a better understanding about what the buyer is saying and then acknowledge their statement. This helps to demonstrate that you as a salesperson are a reasonable person and you can appreciate other people's opinions. It also might give you a chance to compose your thoughts and determine how you want to assess and respond. That leads us to the next step, which is assessment. It's sort of similar to assessment in the ADAPT process of questioning. This is where you deal with buyer resistance, where the salesperson asks assessment questions to help gain a better understanding of exactly what the buyer said and why they're saying it, and to determine if there's any miscommunication. This will help you make a better, more informed, and logical response. That leads us to the next step, which is respond. Based on your understanding of what the buyer is saying and why they're resisting, you can respond to the buyer's resistance. You should structure your response and follow a method that is most appropriate for the situation. No matter which type of response you choose, it's important to make sure that you're still being professional and respectful. And the last part is confirm. After responding, the salesperson should ask questions that are confirmatory in nature. These can be response checks or checkbacks to make sure that the buyer's concerns have been adequately met by the salesperson. Once you have completed the confirmation phase, you can continue with your presentation. This indicates that the buyer confirmation is sufficient and will allow you to move on potentially to gaining a commitment and closing the sale. So, in summary, sales resistance is viewed as opportunities to sell in recent years. It should never be looked at as a closing of the door. Typically, when a client or prospect raises objections, there's a misunderstanding to the value that can be received. But still, there are many reasons why prospects raise objections, and it's the salesperson's job to understand those reasons and explore them. Using the LARK system is an effective process for salespeople to overcome sales resistance. It shows that you respect the buyer's opinion, and that you're going to respond in a thoughtful and respectful manner. There's different ways that salespeople can respond to objections. The best way to respond will usually depend on your relationship with the buyer or the prospect. It may also depend on the product or service that you're selling.